Hi, I'm Dr. Gwyn Erwin, and welcome back to my channel, Healing for Your Life. I'm so happy to be with you today, and today's video is going to continue our developmental playlist. If you remember, and you can see from the little chart that I've imposed, there are 7 keystones to healthy development. The first is the video we already have present on states of being. And the second is on memory and memory systems. So when you think about development, we're thinking about these 7 aspects and how they interrelate. And as I said in the very first video on the developmental process, there is a linear order to development. I mean, there's certain things the baby can do at the beginning, and then at 3 months, and then at 6 months, and throughout the lifespan. But there's also a dynamic element where things don't come on board in such a chronological fashion, but they all interrelate. So think of kind of a brick wall where the bricks are not just on top of each other, but are staggered. And the process of development is sort of like that. That's not the best analogy in the world, but it's good enough for today. So we're also interested in how these 7 keystones that I've conceptualized into my model of healthy development comes on board. So states of being exist in utero and continue throughout the lifespan. Our memory systems, if you remember from that video, in the first type of memory, implicit memory, it begins at the later stages of in utero and continues throughout the lifespan. And explicit memory, which we think of as recall, begins about the 3rd year of life and continues throughout the lifespan. Today, we're going to focus on the keystone that is on internalization, which includes identification. Now, internalization is a process. States and memory are dynamics and they're processes. But internalization is not a willful act or a purposeful act, but it is a process of being in which the infant, starting in infancy, and then throughout our lifespan, we take in from the environment. We internalize aspects of the environment. And whether we want to or not, we do. We internalize relationships. We internalize experiences. We internalize things that regulate us and shape us and form us. We want those to be good things, but of course then trauma occurs and we're internalizing that. But today we're going to focus on healthy aspects of internalization and how that process occurs. So this process of internalization is how the person we started out to be gets built up over time or is impeded in getting built up the way we would like to be over time. The very first form of internalization is called incorporation, and that occurs from birth, well, late in utero, to about 3 to 4 months of age. And incorporation is like water to a sponge. The baby is just taking in and taking in and taking in and taking in, and it just becomes a part of that baby. There's no thought processing involved. There's no specificity to it. So if a baby is held lovingly and responded to lovingly, they are going to feel loved. And they're too young to even realize there is another mommy or daddy is just an extension of themselves or a primary caregiver. And so they're just soaking up what they get. And as we will revisit these 7 aspects in traumatic development, we'll see how the trauma builds up internally. But today we're just focusing on the healthy. and the non-traumatized. So in those first few months of life, without differentiation between body and mind, because the baby's kind of one unit that hasn't differentiated yet, and also everything is sort of a part of the baby from the baby's vantage point. They're just swimming in this world. So everything that they take in that is meaningful becomes a part of themselves. Now, that doesn't mean we take in everything. Lots of things go by and may not have any meaning at all. But the way we're treated, the functions that other people provide for us, the emotional life of other people, and how they respond to us, and how they receive us, all of that is getting built up into the inner world. And that ushers in the first stage of identifications. It isn't a digression, but as a note, Sigmund Freud wrote voluminously. There are 24 volumes in the standard edition of his works. And while not everything he decided or theorized has been proven true, the majority of what he theorized has indeed been validated again and again and again. And one of his major preoccupations in his writing was about identifications. Interestingly enough, it appears in every single paper he wrote. And W.W. Meisner is a Jesuit psychoanalyst who is sort of a Freud expert. He's read everything Freud has ever written, and he's traced all of Freud's thoughts on identification and on how he evolved his theory over time of what identification is. Where Freud landed finally, after decades of work and research, is that identification has as its purpose the growth of the self, or what he called the growth of the ego. Now, we're using the word ego in terms of self, not a sense of self, although there are people who use it that way, and there are other people who think of ego in terms of egotistical. We're talking about it in terms of the self. And so identification is used by the ego psychologically in order to grow the self. And it occurs only via an emotional tie to a significant other. Now, it doesn't have to be the significant other. It can be a significant other. So, mommy, daddy, grandparents, ultimately siblings, later friends, extended family, teachers, mentors, eventually love people, our own children. So it's an ongoing process. We are always identifying. But the primary identification for an infant is usually with mother or father or whoever is the primary caregiver. And that emotional tie, as the baby absorbs, incorporates, internalizes that person, helps grow the baby's sense of self. Now, this is not imitation or mimicry. The baby isn't learning to mimic the other. The baby is literally taking that other in, and it becomes a part of itself. But the way it becomes a part of itself is quite beautiful, because it's not growing a clone of the other. It is growing the baby's natural tendencies, natural temperament, and natural proclivities according to the baby. So it isn't that you'll hear little kids say, I want to be just like mommy, or I want to be just like daddy when I grow up. And they're not literally saying they want to be like their mother, a clone of their mother or father. They're saying they want to be that kind of person. A person who cherishes, a person who cares, a person who's devoted, a person who's protective. And so as the child has primary identifications with caring caregivers who provide closeness and comfort and love and safety, that is going to grow all of those qualities of being of that child's selfhood. Now, secondary identifications are those that come and build on top of that, and they continue throughout life, and they're of the same kind of ilk, where you have later relationships that are very meaningful, where there are emotional ties, and where those relationships, as they are taken in, help grow the self of this person. So I had beloved grandmothers and a grandfather. One grandfather I didn't know, but my grandparents, in very different ways, were immensely important to me. They still inform me, especially one of my grandmothers, every single day of my life. She's the one who gave me words and books and stories and nature, and she just adored me, which was so lovely for me, because she loved teaching me and she loved mentoring me and she enjoyed me. I had a godmother who felt very much the same way, and a godfather. And those were such vital relationships. Siblings are a little more complicated, so in some ways I can identify with some of them, and in other ways I couldn't identify at all. It depends. As we grow up, we may have a beloved teacher or a coach or an extended family member, an aunt or an uncle or a cousin. We may have certain friends that we admire tremendously, or friends of older siblings who are very influential in our growth and the kind of person we want to become. And then as we become adults, we have love relationships, and then those relationships prompt us to be even more of ourselves, hopefully. If they're healthy, they're interested in our growth and our development. And the way they treat us and the way we treat them, there is this exchange back and forth in terms of growing the selves of each other. And then we have children. And our children may be fundamentally like us, pace-wise or temperament-wise, or they may be very different from us. And again, we may identify with some of those qualities, really admire them and appreciate them and think, gee, wish I could be more like that. Maybe I'll try some of that on for size. Again, not in an imitative way, but in terms of a quality of being. Same thing with grandchildren. I'm sure that I was an influence to my grandparents, especially this one grandmother, as much as she was to me. Her life had taken a very hard turn because of the stock market crash that wiped out everything she and my grandfather had. This is before I was born. And she had to live the rest of her life in a very dependent position financially on my parents, which was very hard on her emotionally. It really, I think, compromised her sense of self and made her feel she had to fight for her dignity. She's a brilliant woman, a scholar, and so I just loved her in this unbridled way, and I'm sure that that gave her a renewed sense of self, even just from my love of her. So there are many, many ways that we are built up in terms of our sense of self, and that we build up the sense of self and the selves of others. So keep that in mind as you look at your relationships and how you're influenced and how you influence others. The last piece I want to mention today is a word called introject. Introjects are the opposite of identifications. If you ever read analytic literature, you'd find thousands of papers on both of these subjects, or all of them, internalization, identifications, and introjects. And a lot of people have their own kind of twists and turns on the meanings of them, but I'm going to give you kind of the one that I landed on, very influenced by Meisner's work and Freud's. And Freud did not come up with the word introject. He really got that from Sandor Ferenczi. But an introject is also an internalization. But instead of like an identification growing the ego, it's like almost a living barnacle that attaches to your psyche in a very negative way. We internalize by introjecting someone, and usually that introject attaches to what we call the superego, which should be ideally our conscience that is value-driven, but often for people it's a very punitive, kind of scolding conscience that is corrective and somewhat punishing. It can be. And an introject aligns with that part of our psychical structure, and it continues to do internally the same job it did externally. And we're going to cover this more in the paired video of this Keystone when we get to trauma. But just to give you some short examples, you'll hear people say, oh, I have these negative tapes running in my head. Those are all based on introjects. Those are the quote-unquote voices of parents who were critical or perfectionistic or who could never be pleased, or parents who failed you or failed themselves in terms of how they lived their lives. And so those are the tapes that say, oh, why do you think you can do this? Oh, you're not good at that. Oh, you shouldn't even try. Nothing's going to work out for you. Those kinds of tapes that are running are the activity of the internalization of negative relationships that continue to operate in our inner world and our internal structure while we continue to live. And they're very destructive. They belittle us, they demean us, they humiliate us internally, they stop us, they thwart us, they help us to be self-sabotaging and to fail. And I like to think of them as a sidecar on a motorcycle, because while you might hear those tapes in your own voice, they are really introjects that you have absorbed and taken in. And sometimes we have what's called the identification with the aggressor. And I'm going to speak a little bit about this, but more in the other video. If somebody has an aggressor or more in their lives, they are put into this very challenging position where they have to choose whether to identify with the aggressor in order to have some power, and then they act that out, or they choose not to identify with the aggressor, which puts them in the victim position. And so in that case, we need identifications that grow our sense of self so that we don't have to be in either position, identifying with the aggressor or becoming a victim. Anyway, that's sort of how introjects work. Remember that it's a sidecar to you or the motorcycle, and it's a sidecar. It can get detached. You can find a way to work through those tapes and to strip those introjects of power. And we will be talking about that in further videos. Thank you for being with me today. I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now.